This is Microeconomics, Chapter 8. We're looking at the application of producer and consumer surplus in the case of taxes. All right, we've already talked about taxes before at the end of Chapter 6. We said that it doesn't matter if you levy it on the buyer or the seller. Now, if you were to place it on the buyer, as y'all remember, it shifts demand to the left. If we were to levy it on the seller, it would shift supply to the left, but we get to the same outcome. And this was on your exam, and you had to identify these prices. So when we're at equilibrium, the price that buyers pay and the price that sellers get is the same. But now with this tax wedge, or this price wedge, as you all know, the price that buyers pay is going to have to be higher. The price that sellers receive is lower. So they're not equal anymore, and they're separated by that tax wedge. And it shrinks the market overall. Well, also remember, in Chapter 6, we talked about the burden of the tax and tax incidence, and it depends on which side of the market is more inelastic than the other in terms of who bears most of the tax burden. So in this chapter, we're pretending that all of that has already happened and that we are starting out with this graph right here. You'll know this graph already, but we're pretending the shift either of the demand curve to the left or supply to the left has already occurred. And we're just going to start with this figure. All right, so how does a tax affect market participants? Well, we know that the consumer surplus is associated with buyers and producer surplus is associated with sellers, but now we're going to add a third party that we have to think about, the government. The government levies a tax in order to, get some revenue, right? Some tax revenue from us. And they're going to take some of the surplus too. Before we were just talking about consumer and producer surplus. Now they're getting a piece of the pie as well. Okay, so let's take a look at that figure. There's equilibrium. There's the tax wedge, separating the price that buyers pay from the price that sellers receive. And to figure out the tax revenue, remember, revenue is equal to price times quantity, right? The price or the size of the tax is going to be equal to that tax wedge. And then quantity is going to be equal to the quantity that's sold. Remember, this is the amount that was sold without the tax, but now we have shrunk the market because of this higher price that buyers pay. And so to figure out the tax revenue, it's this pink area right here. So you can see, not only are we shrinking the market, so we were selling this quantity, now we're selling this quantity, but look how much of consumer and producer surplus is now going to the government in the terms of tax revenue. So if we look at, just comparing welfare without a tax, we didn't have to think about the government before. Now, with the tax, you can see after you take out that pink rectangle, there's going to be definitely smaller consumer and producer surplus. Because we've shrunk the market overall, first of all, and then we've got to give some of it to the government. So some welfare is lost out overall, even if you were to count that tax revenue, that pink rectangle, as part of surplus. Okay, we just did this together on that blue piece of paper. I told you to draw producer and consumer surplus. All right. If this is equilibrium right here, before the tax, y'all tell me which letters correspond with the area of consumer surplus. A and B and C. It's the area below the demand curve and above price, right? Okay, which letters correspond with producer surplus? D, E, and F. Okay, now we've got a tax right here, this tax wedge separating the price that buyers pay from the price that sellers receive. So here's our tax wedge. What's our new consumer surplus? The new consumer surplus is going to be only A. Remember, it's the area below demand and above the price. And this is the price that buyers are going to have to pay after the shift, after what's happened in Chapter 6. So here was old consumer surplus, A, B, and C. Now new consumer surplus after the tax is just A. What about new producer surplus?
F.
It's only F. Remember, the definition of producer surplus is the area above supply and below price, and it's that. Okay. Well, which portions go to the government now?
B and D.
B and D. What happens to C and E?
Left off. Don't exist.
No one gets it after the tax because we're only selling this amount in the market now. We have shrunk the market with this tax, and so we call C and E, this part right here, dead weight loss.
Dead weight.
Dead weight loss. Just like James was saying, no one gets it. As y'all know, taxes raise the prices, and then people, according to the law of demand, people respond to incentives. People respond to higher prices. And if it's high enough for them to say, I'm not going to buy this product, or I'm not going to buy as much as before, then it shrinks the market. And a tax gives buyers the incentive to consume less and sellers to consume less. And that's what your author is saying here, that taxes can distort incentives. Okay, and that summarizes what we were just talking about. So we've been talking about efficiency and how markets can do a great job of allocating resources. Well, now we've got the government, levying a tax, and they're shrinking the market, and you can see that we're losing out on that C and E portion of Figure 3, and we're losing out on some of the gains to trade, really. I'm going to skip over to this slide. Is that dead weight loss, now we're going to have it if we're going to implement a tax, there's going to be some dead weight loss there. Is it going to be big or small? And the answer to that question is that it depends on the elasticity of supply and demand. And we've mentioned this before in Chapter 5. Now, does this make sense? The greater the elasticity, remember that deals with the responsiveness or flexibility of buyers and sellers to respond to changes in price. The greater the elasticity, the greater the flexibility, the greater the dead weight loss. Remember, for something that you don't really need, like movie tickets or going on a fancy vacation or a really, really nice expensive purse, you don't need it. You're really responsive to changes in price. If it's super expensive and you decide not to buy it, if a lot of people decide not to buy it, you all can imagine that there'll be more and more of a dead weight loss if more and more people are not buying it because it's something that they can respond to. So let's take a look at a couple of examples here. So in Figure 5, Panel A, we've got inelastic supply and elastic supply. We're pretending that demand is relatively elastic. So what's going on here? Remember, think of a stadium or a theater. They've got a fixed number of seats. So they're, that would be perfectly inelastic. But think of a company that they're not really able, for whatever reason, to respond to changes in price versus a company that is more responsive to changes in price. So with this tax, if you're an apartment manager and you've got this fixed number of units that you can rent out, and all of a sudden the city of Waco gives you a tax, here we go. This is the size of the tax, and then here's the size of the deadweight tax. So think of that for panel A. For panel B, okay, if you're in a more, think about maybe a manufacturing company where you don't have to keep making CDs. You can switch to making toys. You can switch to making backpacks. If the government decides to levy a tax, a really heavy tax on CDs, you can easily switch to producing something else, right? So if you are leaving, more sellers can respond, not leave, if more sellers can respond and change to something else, then the number of CDs that were made before might be out here, the number of CDs that were made is now here at this quantity, and you can see that the more elastic or responsive suppliers are, the greater the deadweight loss because they're changing. They're able to respond and change. So the more elastic the market is, the more sellers can respond, switch to producing something else. Figure 5, we're looking at differences in demand. So if this is something that you really need, the quantity isn't going to change that much when the price goes up, right? So the quantity might decrease from this to this. Now, if this is demand for a luxury item that you don't have to have, maybe before vacations, the quantity of vacations taken was way up here at 100, and then after the tax, let's say that this is road trips. If we're talking about gas, taxes on gas, that's something that we can decide we don't have to do, right? We can stay in town, we can have a staycation and stay here in Waco. If a lot of people respond, then you can see a larger change in quantity of road trips being taken, and therefore the deadweight loss is going to be larger, the more elastic the side of the market. That makes intuitive sense, right? Just thinking back to inelastic, inflexible, the quantity is not going to change that much. And so the triangle is not going to be that big. Elastic, we're able to respond, we're able to change, we're able to switch to something else. And so the quantity from before to the quantity after is going to be pretty big. And because of that flat shape of demand or supply, whatever we're talking about, we're going to have a bigger triangle there. And all these ideas go back to the question, how big should the government be? We say that markets work most of the time. That's the best way to organize market outcomes. But then sometimes the market fails, so we need the government to step in. Well, if the government's going to step in and punish people who are littering or help out with subsidies for loans and education and things like immunizations, if that's good, then where's the government going to get money to do those kinds of things? Taxes. And then how much do we tax? Because there's going to be some deadweight loss associated with taxes. So we're just going to have to, think, how big should the government be? Does the benefit of having the government step in and enforce and punish people who are littering or polluting, if the government stepping in and helping out with meals, free and reduced meals for students, is that benefit greater than the deadweight loss that's going to be caused by them, charging taxes? Because that's how they're going to pay for implementing those policies. And economists disagree, by the way, on the answer to this question. And it's because of their perspectives on elasticity. For example, I think we've mentioned this before with the payroll tax. Some economists say that labor supply is really inelastic. People need to work, they need a full-time job, they need their benefits through a full-time job. And so if we levy a payroll tax, even if it was on employers, they're able to push more of the burden of it onto the employees because they have to work. Other labor economists say that labor supply is more elastic. If there are more and more taxes that employees are going to have to pay, people are going to start working fewer hours, maybe refusing to work overtime, or maybe start working for a job where they don't have to pay taxes. Maybe say, I'm going to mow your lawn for cash only. So there is a disagreement, and your chapter, your author says, this argument still goes on even today. But in any event, we know that taxes do change the market. They do distort the decisions and distort incentives when we're talking about labor earnings and we're taxing labor earnings. Okay, another thing that we need to talk about with taxes is that they don't stay the same for a long time. They're always going up or increasing or decreasing. So, looking at the relationship between tax revenue and deadweight loss, it actually changes after a certain point. Okay, so we said the more elastic the side of the market is, the bigger the deadweight loss. Now, we're saying as the tax increases, as the size of the tax gets bigger, and you have to pay more and more taxes, that can increase deadweight loss too. So if the government decides to increase taxes, they'll be able to increase tax revenue, right? But only for a little bit. It's actually going to decrease after a certain point. So let's see what happens. On figure 6, we've got 3 panels here, A, B, and C. We've got a small tax, a medium-sized tax, and then a large tax. So here's our small tax. As y'all know, here's equilibrium before the tax. Here is the tax wedge and the quantity that's sold after the tax at Q2, the price that buyers pay, and the price that sellers receive. So here is the quantity that's sold after the tax. Here's the price of the tax. That's price times quantity is revenue. Okay, so there's the tax revenue. As y'all know, that triangle represents the deadweight loss. And what if we had a medium-sized tax? So that tax wedge is going to be bigger. Now it's here. What's happened to tax revenue? How does this blue rectangle compare to this one? It's a little bigger. So if the government is trying to get more tax revenue, maybe decrease the deficit like ours is trying to do right now, they are going to increase taxes. They increased our payroll taxes. Y'all saw that this year with if you looked on your pay stub. Okay, well, what if they keep trying to do it? If they were to move from a medium-sized tax to a large tax, so this tax wedge here, it's really big now. What's happened to that blue rectangle? Yeah, it's taller, but if you take the area of it, it's actually going to be less than this one. It's actually going to be less. And look at the deadweight loss. What's happening to deadweight loss every time, these pink triangles? Getting bigger every time, but the tax revenue gets bigger and then it gets smaller again as we move from a small to a large tax. So if we were to have 2 separate graphs, one for the deadweight loss, those pink triangles, okay, that's always going to be going up, and then one for the tax revenues goes up and then it goes back down. So here's our deadweight loss. That pink triangle always increased. The tax revenue went up and then down. We have a name for that. It's called the Laffer curve. Named after an economist who said, who told the government, if you want to increase tax revenue, at some point you're going to actually have to cut back on the size of taxes. Because you keep taxing people more and more and more, what are people going to do?
Buy less and less.
Okay, buy less and less. What about if we're talking about labor? If we're trying to implement more and more payroll taxes?
I'm going to work less hours.
I'm going to reduce their inputs, so they work less.
That's right. People respond to incentives. We learned that on the very first day. Even Ronald Reagan, there's a quote from him in the chapter. You all might remember he was an actor before he was president. And in this interview, even Ronald Reagan said, after we made 4 movies, you're pushed into that highest tax bracket, and then we didn't want to pay more taxes after that. And so I think the quote is, we went out into the country and played after that. We didn't work anymore after that because we knew we were going to have to pay more taxes. So I'm teaching 2 classes this summer. I used to just teach 1 because one of our other economics instructors was thinking that, when we do schedules, it's so far in advance that payroll taxes may increase at the beginning of this year. And so, he was thinking, I don't want to be pushed into the next highest tax bracket. I'll go ahead and let you take the class. And so, do people respond to incentives and think about this? Absolutely. Even Ronald Reagan did. Okay, so just to sum up, how much revenue the government gains or loses from taxes doesn't only depend on the size of the tax, but it also depends on elasticities, if people are able to respond to those changes. It also affects people's behavior, because people do respond to incentives. And that is the end of Chapter 8.